Professor Allison and
Thank you.
Juliet. That's an amazing range of things that we talked about, and we have about 25 minutes for questions. We're not going to take our normal break today because we started a little late. I guess I want to ask one question and then we'll open it up, and that is, you know, the broad question, given the budget constraints we see here, when is it appropriate? This is a question to both of you. When is it appropriate that we actually do use a military approach to a problem we face? The one that seems like it may come up in the future is Iran and their potential nuclear threat. So in your opinions, both in terms of what we do in terms of defense policy and what we do in terms of homeland security, when is it appropriate, presumably sometimes it's appropriate, to use the military option to deal with a problem, as opposed to soft power or some of the other things we talk about?
So, I think, I mean, it's a big, complicated question, but I think the question of when should the American president send troops to kill and to die would be my sharper version of it. And then there's another little bit of a version, well, how about just bombing people with drones or something like that? So I would say the principle should be that only when vital American national interests are at stake should we send Americans to kill and to die. And there's a kind of a hierarchy of interests, and we can have some debate about those. But vital in the Webster's dictionary says essential to the survival and well-being thereof. So it therefore does not include lots of things that it might be nice to send Americans to do, but which I would say as a presumption or rule of thumb, the rule should be no. Okay? Now then for the next level of interest, for extremely important interests that are extremely important but that's not quite vital, the principle should be a presumption that if other parties in whom we have a stake regard it as vital, and if they're prepared to do a good bit of the lifting, we might join a coalition, but we're not going to do it ourselves unilaterally, and we're not necessarily going to have to lead the battle. So I would say Libya is a quite good example for me of a case where it was horrible what was happening in Libya, and there's no question that a lot of people would have been slaughtered, but that was not a vital American interest, I believe. So I think the president made the right decision that if you could get a coalition of people, and if other people would do a good bit of the lifting, the more they would do, if we get to a good enough result, that's good enough. Now we could get a little bit more complicated if you take in limited uses of force. But I think it's not simply the money, though it is the money, that's a big bit, but blood is even more precious than money. And while as you think about spending blood, American blood, and also, which we tend not to recognize enough, actually spending the blood of some other guys too, who happen to be the ones we're fighting. This is like a huge decision, and I think the reason why presidents feel this is such an agonizing event is they know if they send people to fight and to die, and to kill, that they're going to go thinking, wait a minute, that's somebody's son, that's somebody's wife or husband, that's somebody's brother. That's one of our fellow citizens. And one of the, I think, painful facts, and I'm sorry to go so long about it, but I think the painful fact about the professional military, now that we've gotten rid of the draft, and painful for me and for all of us, I think, is that actually there's professionals that go and do this. But how about the rest of us? And so if it actually were, we were all in part of a lottery, so some people in our family might be part of this, So we would have a little bit more skin in the game. I think we would be somewhat more reserved.
And we were
And we were.
in the 1960s.
I think that what Professor Allison just said, everyone, I
Graham,
think, was take
please.
Graham, was, I don't know, but everyone, I hope everyone was taking notes, because I think, not just on the vital and less than vital, but, to call sending troops, are you willing to have someone die for this cause, is the right way to conceptualize it, because we tend to view war as like, it's so generic and has no meaning. It's too not personal. And both Graham and I know people in the military. We know people who served. Less than 1% of the American population serves now. So most of you might go through your entire lives not having any interaction with the military or the National Guard, who are our citizen soldiers here in Massachusetts. And to think of it that way, to give a human background to it, and to think that's what in fact we're doing, so that there's all these euphemisms for war and political campaigns, which I just, we gotta be more aggressive, harsher, we gotta set these red lines, as if, what do these words mean? Nothing. Sending someone to die is the way to think about it, and then I think there will be times when you're willing to do that, but the balance will change a little bit.
Question over here, and please tell us who you are before giving your question.
Hi there. My name is Sean Collins. I graduated a couple months ago. Faculty here from Northeastern. Thank you both for coming. I had a question specifically. Professor Kayemi brought up the fact that there is now in the transition from one administration to the next,
Yeah.
and the separation, the form of separation from Homeland Security and national security, that the words used, I think, there's been an injection of intellectual rigor,
Yeah,
which
yeah.
is great.
Yes.
It's nice. But also the fact that that these policies that the United States approaches these specific areas, where before they might have been very much cloistered in their own separate, untouchable place, should be integrated as part of a much larger look at the government's role in every government, here and abroad, etc. I'm wondering, and maybe Professor Allison can speak a little to this. I wonder about the kind of pushback from people who were traditionally used to that structure of, military, homeland security, national security, foreign policy and defense. Don't talk about it. It's not part of your problem. Let's do it. Look at all the money we have. Clearly, we know what we're doing. How much of a pushback has there been, from a traditionalist standpoint on, they know what they're doing, let them do what they do.
Right. So it's a great question. So I think that's going to take some time. So the way government is set up is most agencies are doing their own, are doing interagency work all the time. The Defense Department is, working with Homeland Security because of the National Guard, and and then when something percolates up, there's going to be meetings at the National Security staff, and then if it gets bigger, it's the deputies meeting, and then the principals meeting. That's sort of the structure. And I can't name a single, this is my world though, but I can't name a single meeting involving sort of Homeland Security response or all this stuff that didn't bring up something that was completely like sort of merging all of these different areas. So one of the examples I used was the BP oil spill, which I was intimately involved with, and the interagency collaboration. So you can imagine at this table, there's the State Department, right? Why are they there? Why is the State Department at the table? Why? Because they had one thing on their mind. It was hilarious, but you can understand why. Which was that the flow of the oil would go to Cuba. And we had no interaction with Cuba, because that's our policy. And like, what were we gonna do? What would we help them clean it up? And that's like their sort of myopic. This is what everyone does at deputies meetings. They have their thing. But it also involved, right, for Veterans Affairs, there's a lot of veterans in the Gulf who were losing the capacity, and it also involved the Department of Education, because it was summertime and a lot of camps were closed. So what are you gonna do? So to me, it's becoming much more natural in this interagency thing. I will say the one area where that this hasn't penetrated, and I actually respect it, I'm a big fan of need to know in certain circumstances. And you can see it in the picture of the Bin Laden raid. Who is not there? It's my boss, Janet Napolitano. You know, which is just a way of that intel, that hardcore intel stuff, covert ops is still in its own area.
I agree completely, and I think Julian actually gave a terrific picture earlier. I would just make one addition. When the debate after 9/11 came up about a Department of Homeland Security, one of our colleagues, Rich Falkenrath, was in the midst of the mix. And in principle, you would think of it as defense. So you have defense and you have homeland defense, because what are they doing? I mean, what is security, you know, supposed, but the Defense Department would have nothing of it, nothing. So the bureaucratics, as you suggest, are a powerful part of this picture. And from the Defense Department's perspective, most of the people who go to work there, even though they want to be safe while they're at home, and I always give Julian thanks for the good work they did in Massachusetts to make us safer, you know, from here, and things that happen. Well, the Defense Department, well, but, you know, we're in a different league, we do a different thing. It's not really, you know, that.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Question over here. Please tell us who you are.
Hi, Steve Nathanson. I teach philosophy here at Northeastern. I want to go back to Gary's question about decisions to go to war or how to fight them. And I'm thinking about this President Obama's decision to do the surge strategy. My own interpretation of that, and I'm not an expert on these things at all, but it seemed to me that although President Obama, I think, is really a serious person and does take seriously the cost in human life and human well-being of the war, that decision was really a political decision. And that, in a way, it says something bad about our politics, that had he made the decision that, well, actually, the situation in Afghanistan is rather bleak, we're not going to win, really, we're not going to defeat the Taliban, there's no reason to believe we would, and that sending more people actually was just going to lead to more people dying, being injured, etc., both people in Afghanistan and American troops. And so basically, what he did, in my view, and I don't necessarily even criticize it for this, but was to sort of split it down the middle. That in order to ward off the people who would call him too weak, if we just pulled out and said, this is a losing thing, let's not waste any more lives, he sent in 30,000 troops for a period of time. And in order to protect himself against the criticism that he was getting us into another endless war, he put a deadline on the end of the war. And people at the time said it was a contradictory policy, and it was in a certain way, but it also was a perfect policy for warding off two contradictory kinds of criticisms. But essentially, it was an act, in my view, of political self-defense, political defense by the president. And I wonder, so our talking about how these things should be done in some ideal sense, in a certain way, is, it's not a picture, it doesn't include all of these political elements that are very powerful, I think.
Thank you, Steve.
It's a great topic, and it's a long, complicated subject. I'm a student of decision-making in government, so I've looked at that case quite carefully. If one wants to read about it, because of the leakiness of our government, Woodward's book on Obama's decision to go to war has got virtually the verbatim discussion of the 8 National Security Council meetings for more than 25 hours that he conducted, basically like a law seminar, going through, trying to understand the issue. So I would say about it, I think you're about half right from what you said, just in terms of my judgment. You started with a new president. So, here he is, first, gets inaugurated January 2009. This issue is right on the table. He's young. He doesn't have any military background. He's a Democrat. He's got a problem because his military comes to him with a proposal, and this comes from McChrystal, that says either we're on a trajectory to defeat, and if we don't have a big increment of forces to bend the trend line, in your first year or two, we're going to be defeated in Afghanistan. Once that report was written, within a week it's in public, so it's in the newspaper. We're reading it before he actually has a meeting with his advisors. So at that stage, he's got really two choices. He can back his military commanders, or he can back down. So I think he got jammed by the combination of a process of a report and decision process that he didn't understand. But of course, most new presidents don't understand. I mean, he just got there. He's been doing other things. And secondly, by a pervasive press that made this play out in public. Because once it was framed in public as back your commanders or back down, I told my class about this. Jack Reed, who's the senator from Rhode Island, and is on the Armed Services Committee, is a very smart observer of Washington decision making. He says, and he told me, when McChrystal was appointed in June or July of 2009, this is before the report, he wrote down on a piece of paper 40,000. When McChrystal's report was published, which was like a week after it was given to Obama, that's Labor Day of 2009, I wrote down on a piece of paper to Jack, 30,000 plus or minus 10. Obama got to that conclusion in December, after all these meetings, where he was basically jammed.
Remember the name.
Yeah.
Question? Over here.
Hello, thank you for coming to Northeastern. My name is Mladen. I'm a PhD candidate at the Political Science Department. I come from Serbia. I'm curious about the public diplomacy of candidates, and do you think Obama did well in that regard? Not only public diplomacy toward the international actors, but also public diplomacy toward the domestic population, because you mentioned keep calm and carry on. And in Katrina, in New Orleans, there was a lot of looting and even killing, and you have to kind of work on that culture. What do you do when you're out of electricity?
Right.
So I'm curious about use of public diplomacy, movies and things like that to deal with. Thank you.
No, I mean, I'm totally clear because I do find it odd sometimes to talk about a mood. I mean, I've been in sort of operational roles for a huge part of my career. I think public diplomacy is important. I think public diplomacy won't get you very far if the policy's bad. And I think, that's, George Bush put a lot of effort on public diplomacy. He hired a lot of really powerful women to run these offices over the course of his administration. If you're in two wars that nobody likes in that part of the world, no amount of educating young girls is going to help, right? I mean, it's just not going to work. And so, just being realistic about public diplomacy. But I do think, if this chart is the weakest link of foreign policy or defense policy, right? That I do think that a contributing factor is our propensity to completely freak out about everything. Because I think the outside world, I read Al Jazeera English. I think anyone who's interested in the Middle East should read it, and should read foreign press because I think it's important. And, I hate to say, the tsunami, how many, 250,000 people died in 4 days, right? And I mean, this is what the world is grappling with. And so if we could sort of show some empathy that we are damn lucky to be here, and would change some of that new dynamic that you're talking about.
Question?
Matt Murphy, I'm a retiree. Is it economically feasible to cut the defense budget, given that it is ongoing stimulus?
Very, very good question. This is probably better for the debate that you had with Greg and Larry,
Yeah.
because the Keynesians would argue that if you're in the midst of insufficient demand, that more demand from government is making up for the demand that citizens aren't doing, because you're trying to get your economy to revive. And therefore, if you spent money doing things that the society would otherwise need to do, like maybe rebuilding your defense stock that got run down during the war, or maybe rebuilding your airports or your roads.
Or your train.
Or your train. we might even have a fast train that went from somewhere to somewhere,
Right.
and Julian
Right.
would be here.
So a lot of stops between New York and Boston there.
If you go to China,
Yeah.
I mean, I think, what? You go sit on the train from Shanghai to wherever. You sit there with a glass like this. I mean, you've heard these stories. The guy, you get on the train and it fills up your glass with wine right here to the edge. And the train's going to go, and it's going at 220 miles an hour. I'm terrified. Don't worry. Don't touch it. Don't touch it. It's going to be fine. And it's serious like that. So I would say there's a lot of things you would spend money on in the Keynesian terms, and defense would be one of them.
Question over here.
I'm Tom Limberg. I used to be a lawyer, but I'm in recovery. My question is about cutting the defense budget.
Juliet recovered too, so
Yes.
it's okay.
So just the 2 or 3 things that are obvious. We didn't get a peace dividend. Instead, it's gone like this, not counting those wars. We have 800 or whatever some odd bases around the world that we know about. That we know about, and even the Cato Institute, which is not exactly a liberal institution, says we could cut the defense budget more or less in half and be utterly and thoroughly protected. So, order of magnitude, how much do you think we could cut out of the defense budget? I'm not asking for a number. I'm asking for a percentage, in the nearest 10%, 20%.
Oh my goodness, it's an extremely good question, and I think what we haven't managed, and you're certainly right, after the wars, we haven't managed a serious strategic review that says, what do we want to accomplish in the world, and what forces do we need for those purposes, and then how much are we prepared to pay for it. And in particular, now that, given our other fiscal problems, and given that we have a number of allies and friends, is it required that we do kind of everything? As people say, well, we've always done everything, that would be a good idea to continue doing it. Now, I don't have any doubt myself that our society can pay for whatever level of defense we choose. So defense, you're talking about 3.5% of GDP, 4%, 2.5%. This is a small potatoes in a $15 trillion economy if we decide to tax ourselves to pay for it. So I would say we should pay for whatever defense we have, and we should buy whatever defense we need. So now we come to hard questions like the following. So we're going to pivot to Asia, or rebalance to Asia, and we need more carriers, for Governor Dukakis earlier, because we're trying to accomplish what? Well, we always have been the guardians of, we've basically been the architects and implementers and funders of Pax Pacifica. And Pax Pacifica has been a pretty amazing thing. So the Pacific has had a secure, stable, security and economic structure in which you had the fastest growth ever in history of all these countries. So, well, we've been doing this for a long time. We should keep doing it, or we should think, well, maybe somewhere between Japan and China and India and the ASEAN countries, if we had only half the Navy that we had now, could we pretty much accomplish the same thing? So I think that issue, or that debate, we simply haven't engaged.
I'm afraid we're out of time. We could go on for hours, but I want to thank our guests, Graham Allison, Julie. We're going to continue looking at this issue of foreign policy, and particularly looking at Iran, Iraq, and Afghanistan with two wonderful guests next week. Nicholas Burns, also of Harvard University, and our dear friend Steve Kinzer, who's currently professor of international relations at Boston University, but for many years was one of the chief correspondents for the New York Times, serving in the Middle East, and we'll be looking at some of the toughest questions, Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, next Wednesday. See you here. Good night.